conservatives. Ever since 2016, climate change has been my main hobby, trying to influence conservatives to be more cooperative. This has not been very successful. Now the thing is that the environmentalist, the typical environmentalist, is far to the left of the typical Democrat. They're typically not moderate Democrats who are in the environmental movement. So let's see. They typically hate the status quo. They're against capitalism. They're against everything the way things are. They feel that disrupting the existing system is a plus. That's an advantage. A lot of environmentalists are technophobes. They're not even just technically ignorant. They dislike technology. They're ignorant. They're not interested in becoming technically informed. Tend to have a very poor grasp of economics. Never met a regulation they didn't like. And they typically view decarbonization of the economy as economically painless. And they talk about jobs, jobs, jobs. It doesn't occur to them that all of the money that's going to create those jobs has to be diverted from creating other things that we want. Conservatives like the status quo and the American way of life. It's very obvious to them that reducing emissions and replacing our whole energy infrastructure will be expensive. That they frequently use the phrase economic suicide in terms of how unacceptable they see. They typically see regulation as a usually evil thing. They view growth of the public sector as evil. And they hate 95% of what they hear from environmentalists, and it gets so that as soon as they hear the word climate change, they just scream no. Okay, just some technical things. The observed warming, since 2010, we've had 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit, 1.4 degrees centigrade of warming, 1 degree centigrade since 1980. You can't feel 2.5 degrees Fahrenheit difference in temperature. If you had two rooms that were that different, right adjacent to each other with that difference of temperature, and you walk back and forth, you probably would not be able to tell which room was warmer. I compared the temperatures at JFK Airport and Savannah, Georgia. They're both coastal locations, and they're both on the same coast. And 660 miles apart in latitude. The warming that JFK has experienced since the year 2000 is as if JFK has moved 120 miles south. Poles have increased much more. The further you get from the equator, the more warming has occurred. Global wind patterns are largely driven by the temperature gradient as latitude increases. As the poles warm faster than the rest of the planet, that gradient reduces, wind patterns change, the jet stream changes in precipitation patterns, droughts and floods, disruption of agriculture. There's also sea level rise. There's Dunning-Kruger. And one thing that I observed with political polarization is that people who are on one end of the political spectrum and only trust media from one end of the political spectrum and only have social media friends from one end of the political spectrum, they only hear the stupidest things that the other end of the spectrum is saying. So they underestimate the other end of the spectrum. Liberals hear about Trump met with the oil company executives and said, hey, if you give me $1 billion to my campaign fund, I'll give you anything you want. And he didn't get that campaign contribution, but I think he's going to give them anything they want anyway. There's a court case proceeding against Exxon saying that they knew about 40 or 50 years ago that global warming was real, and they funded people to lie to the public and say it was not real. Liberals tend to assume that all of the resistance to climate action originates with fossil fuel funding, which I think is definitely not true. A lot of it is just partly the different view of the world coming from the left and the right. And then like news anchors on mainstream media stations, anytime there's a violent storm they attributed to climate change. It's not really justified. Conservatives hear about nutcases like AOC and the great. I didn't talk about. I'm not talking about the Green New Deal because it takes a couple of minutes. But the Green New Deal was just ridiculous, and I've talked about it at length in previous talks. Greta Thunberg, ignorant, deranged little Swedish kid throwing a temper tantrum at the UN. Idiots throwing soup on masterpieces. Movie stars virtue signaling about how climate conscious they are while having yachts and private jets. A lot of the resistance recently, they don't so much deny that climate change is real. What they talk about is all the problems from solar and wind energy, every problem that happens with solar and wind energy, or every problem with electric cars. They go on and on and on about. They assume that climate research are biased towards justifying more funding. They are blind to the fact that the fossil fuel lobby is funding a lot of people to screen the opposite opinion. And they're quite aware of ignorant Luddite hippie environmentalists. On social media, people gain recognition by deliberately pissing off the other end of the political spectrum. They're just not constructive. So we have extremists like Trump, Margaret Taylor Greene, Bernie, Robert Reich, and AOC hog all the attention, while the centrists and moderates who try to have civil conversations across the spectrum, across the aisle, make compromises, and solve problems can't get noticed. Okay, this is the pause. This is if you look. Okay, this is a climate skeptic, Roy Spencer, at the University of Alabama at Huntsville, posted this chart of like the last 40 years of satellite temperature data. And the red curve is the 1 year average of temperatures, and the blue is just a monthly, which is meaningless. The only reason to have the blue dots in there is to confuse the issue and add noise. I had a climate skeptic show me this and say that there was no warming trend. It's very obvious to me that this end is warmer than this end, and there is a warming trend. But I want to put a 5-year pass on this, so I downloaded the same data from the University of Alabama at Huntsville, and so I have the red curve, which matches his red curve. That's the 1 year average, and I have the green curve, which is a 5-year average. But you see that there's this period from about 1998 to 2016 where warming stopped. And climate skeptics had a field day with this, and they said warming has stopped. We don't have to worry about global warming. We don't have to do anything. But after 2015, warming resumed with a vengeance. And then here's another data set that I got. It turned out that a lot of the pause was caused by the satellite was losing altitude with time, and it wasn't adjusted for. And this is adjusted for that. But there still is a little bit of a pause, though not as much and not as long. Sea level rise. Trump claimed, in the interview with Elon Musk, Trump claimed that scientists expect 1/8 of an inch of sea level rise in 300 years. Musk didn't argue with that. I don't know if Musk knows any better, or if they agreed that Musk wasn't going to call out any of Trump's lies. But we are getting this is a plot that I did. I downloaded the satellite sea level variable. The green is just the raw data, and then the blue is the 3-year average of the raw data. And we're getting 1/8 of an inch every year, and then the red is the gradient of the sea level rise, the rate of sea level rise. It's very noisy, as you can see. But as you can see, the sea level rise has sped up quite a bit. And the brown here is the rate of sea level rise for the last 100 years. So Trump tells that, I've heard him say that lie very often, that the scientists, he just makes it up. He makes up a lot of stuff. Okay, meltdown-proof reactors. This was my baby. I was madly in love with this kind of reactor. This kind of reactor absolutely cannot melt down as long as gravity exists and substances melt at expected temperatures. I was at a nuclear symposium this summer, and there was a there was an expert nuclear engineer, and he said they tried a lot of different reactor designs in the 50s. And I said, well, why did we build these big light water reactors that we have now that will melt down if the cooling system fails, like Fukushima? Why didn't we build meltdown reactors in the first place? And he said, well, this was tried, it had problems. If you had impurities in the molten salt, it formed crystals. It was like being told that my child had cancer and had 6 months to live. It was devastating to me. But there are other meltdown-proof reactors, and China has a meltdown-proof reactor generating electricity on the grid. China and Russia are ahead of us. This is homework that I have to do. I have to study these other meltdown-proof reactor designs and learn about them. Okay, in 2020, I went to 1.5 day, just before the pandemic, I went to a 1.5 day climate conference in 2020. 95% of everybody present were liberals. There were no sessions, not even optional ones on climate science, no sessions, not even optional ones on energy engineering, 3 mandatory hours on social justice. One of the social justice speakers was frankly hostile to the United States. All the liberals thought the social justice talk was wonderful and we should do more of it. I was very vocal about complaining about it. I was kicked off the board of my local chapter because anybody who criticizes social justice is a horrible person in the eyes of liberals. Social justice takes higher priority than saving the planet. Saving the planet was completely forgotten at the conference, and they don't see that as a problem. Okay, New York City had a climate museum in Manhattan. There was no mention of carbon dioxide, solar energy, wind energy, hydro energy, nuclear energy, completely not mentioned. They mentioned redlining. If you're not very old, what redlining was, it was a practice of racial housing discrimination that ended over half a century ago. They mentioned slavery, they mentioned colonialism, they mentioned capitalism, pejoratively. A climate skeptic going to this museum would find his prejudices on the topic completely confirmed. This museum was a complete waste of space. Okay, this is Aaron Mayer. He was president of the Sierra Club. He's from the environmental justice movement, which believes in mixing social justice with environmentalism. He rose to the top of the Sierra Club through that. He went to D.C. He said that climate change is settled, the Earth is warming, and Ted Cruz goaded him into debating climate science. Ted Cruz had obviously had a 1 or 2 hour briefing from the fossil fuel lobby. He totally mopped the floor with this guy. Ted Cruz is a lawyer. He does not have any technical background. Aaron Mayer had been rising through the Sierra Club for 15 years. He had obviously never had a 30-minute briefing on climate science in his life. He didn't think it was important. He was not in DC to discuss global warming in general. He was only interested in the impact on minorities. There was a revenue-neutral carbon tax on the ballot in Washington State in 2016. And if a lot of people like me in the global warming world feel that a revenue-neutral carbon tax is the silver bullet, it is what is needed to solve climate change. And getting a revenue-neutral carbon tax passed anywhere was extremely useful for supporting climate change. He took a do not support position on this. The number one reason was it didn't do enough for communities of color. It's disgraceful that the Sierra Club would elect a president who couldn't win an argument about global warming with Ted Cruz. Environmental justice people say they want to address social justice issues and environmental problems at the same time. They talk about a just transition. The problem is, among liberals, social justice ideology is never to be criticized. Any criticism of social justice ideology and you're a bad person. I got kicked off the board for criticizing it. I was at a dinner with some people. We were at a climate conference in DC, and they went on and on about BLM. I criticized BLM. The people who I was eating dinner with stood up and walked away from the table. I was a bad person. I was giving a talk on climate science this summer. I said something bad about social justice ideology. A woman stood up and left the talk. Okay, anything that is above, you put social justice ideology above criticism, anything you put above criticism becomes sacred and holy. Most liberals believe that social justice ideology is the most noble and urgent cause in human history. Environmental justice types have no desire to solve global warming. They don't find it interesting. They don't think it's important. They just want to change the subject to social justice and talk about that forever. And the liberals won't stop them. And another thing that the environmental justice movement brings up is that oppressed demographics are most impacted by climate change. Therefore, the leadership of the environmental movement should be DEI hires, like Aaron Mayer, which is sort of like saying the American Cancer Society, when they decide which cancer research to fund, they should find dying terminal cancer patients in hospice and ask them which cancer research is the best bet for the money. Okay, social justice ideology, it's like creeping in the whole scientific establishment, and it erodes the credibility of the scientific establishment. Here's an article that was in Scientific American. The denial of evolution is a form of white supremacy. Okay, I've been in skeptics organizations since 1990. I'm very interested in the evolution versus creationism debate. I've read a book by a creationist. I've read a book about why the creationists are wrong. I've listened to many tapes of debates between evolutionists and creationists. I've personally known creationists. It wasn't about race. And furthermore, within the United States, blacks are statistically more likely than whites to be creationists. And I'm sure it's news to those blacks that they are really white supremacists. And then here's this article, Modern Mathematics Confronts its White Patriarchal Past. The article mostly talks about a hostile climate for women. A lot of these anecdotal things they were talking about were 80 years ago. Like, okay, pretty much all of the intellectual achievement 150 years ago was by men, but women have been getting to be a part of it. But saying that math is white and patriarchal is just silly. And when you have this sort of thing creeping out of and when you have scientists talking this way, it degrades the credibility of scientists with the public. Okay, here's something I saw on Facebook in a conservative group. If we divide 123 genders by white supremacy, how much climate change do we have? The thing is, if you use language like white supremacy or systemic racism, conservatives just turn off. They just stop listening to you right there. And yeah, 123 genders, they don't buy into that very well. And then the cancellations. A lot of the problem is the cancellations. Everybody is afraid of their career being ended if they stand up to this madness. Houston Porter was a law student at Pace University. He participated in a panel on trans athletes in women's sports. I think he was against it. At the end, at Q&A, the room erupted into chaos and shouting. Many people were screaming at once. Houston was accused of misgendering somebody, but many people were screaming at once. He doesn't know what the hell happened. He's facing suspension and expulsion. He's 28 years old. He has a lot of student debt. If he's not able to graduate from law school and become a lawyer, he will have a tough time paying off all that student debt. This is the climate of fear on universities. And then we have a school principal, Richard Bilsko. he was a progressive gay, a DEI session by Pike Ojo Thompson. And she said that Canada was a very, very racist place. And he had taught in the United States for 20 years, and he disagreed. And also he said that the way that Canada funds their schools, they fund their schools at the national level, whereas we fund our schools by local property taxes. So schools with black kids in them really get screwed in the US, and that Canada is fairer. So he argued that Canada is more racially just than the US. Well, if you disagree with somebody running a DEI session, she will say horrible things about you. And so she denounced him as a white supremacist. He shut up. She didn't leave him alone. She kept going after him, holding him up as an example of white supremacy in Canada. No one had the guts to stand up for him. This was in front of his peers and his management. Somebody in his management did a tweet saying that the DEI session was doing a great job of ferreting out white supremacists. He lost his job, lost most of his friends, committed suicide. No one is safe. So, you know, a lot of people think, well, they're only canceling conservatives. Actually, that's not true. The liberals are much more vulnerable to this because I think most of his friends were liberals. If you have conservative friends and you get denounced as a bigot, you go find a conservative friend and say, here's what happened. I said this, she said this, I said this, she said that, and then she called me a bigot. And then you both laugh at what an idiot she was. And he evidently didn't have friends like that. So no one is safe from this. These cancellations, something has to be done to bring them under control. Okay, so we're ready for questions now.
Maybe wondering, why the hell is a kid saying what he's about to say? Usually, when I hear white supremacy, I think of the Nazis. Yeah. But so if you disagree with someone, do you just kind of like just randomly accuse them of being a Nazi?
I think that's what people who lead DEI sessions typically do. I have a theory that in any conversation among liberals, the social justice warrior gets anything they want, because the minute they don't, they will accuse all resistance of being a bigot. And most liberals would rather boil their children in oil than be accused of being a bigot. Yes?
So part of the issue with accepting the reality of climate change is acceptance of science in general.
Yes.
Now, I had a friend, lifelong friend from grade school on, who was very conservative. You know, in the 80s, I was whoever the loser was, and he was Reagan, because nobody won against Reagan. And a few years ago, I tried to explain to him the problem with how arch conservatives deal with climate change and deal with the messaging. Because I told him, the messaging that you're taking is not from scientists, it's from environmentalists. Environmentalists don't necessarily go into the details of the science. They'll tell you something like, we have to save the Earth. The Earth is going to be fine. The Earth will support some kind of life. It doesn't care what we do, doesn't care how hot it is or isn't. What we're doing in terms of climate change is affecting us. It's affecting how we live because of how.
Is this your friend speaking, or is this you speaking?
This is me speaking to him.
Okay.
But I told him basically at this point, I told him humans are going to have a lot to deal with economically and otherwise. Polar bears are fucked, but the Earth will be fine. And his response was, polar bears? Oh, they'll just become regular bears. So
that's how evolution works, right?
The lack of basic scientific understanding is a big hill to climb. If we could climb that, things like this would be even clearer. You know? there would not be as much debate about climate change, because they realize there's not that much to debate, except for maybe minutia.
Okay, great.
Why do you think the argument against science is so strong that even in Action Comics #1, the planet's gonna be destroyed? The scientist, Jor-El, is telling the whole entire, all the other scientists, and what's the argument? We don't want to pack, you know, even there in fiction we see this ridiculous battle between, I mean, I can't believe it's repeating in the real world.
Well, I think the environmental left, especially with the Green New Deal, I used to think the Green New Deal set progress with conservatives back about 5 years. Now I think it's about 10 years. My hope is that by the Green New Deal was introduced in the fall of 2018. And my hope is that by the fall of 2028, the conservatives will be about where they were in the fall of 2018 before the Green New Deal was introduced.
So I expected a little more about actually talking to conservatives about climate change in your talk. So I'll ask this question. This may be just from my perception. I wonder if you agree. It seems like a lot of the anti-global warming talk has shifted from no, it's not happening, no, it's not happening, to all right, it's happening, but what can we do about it, or something.
Or they complain about electric cars,
Yeah.
and windmills being destroyed in and solar panels being destroyed by hailstorms,
Yeah. And windmill
windmills
cancer.
killing whales, and everything they can complain about, but their base assumption is that all this is unnecessary, but that they complain about the measures being taken to combat.
So in the people that you interact with, have there been individuals that you know or groups that you know that have gone through the shift of it's not happening to it's not happening and it's not a big deal, it is happening and it's not a big deal, or it is happening and it's not a big deal?
Yeah, I had to eliminate the slides to come down to little enough time, but the most intelligent people against doing anything are saying that they're not arguing with the IPCC reports, but they take a very rosy interpretation of the IPCC reports and say it's not so bad. Like there's this guy Bjorn Lomborg who I talked to personally at a conference, and he says that if we aim for 3 degrees C of warming by 2100, we'll be at about the right level. If we make the effort to hold it to 2 degrees C, we will harm the economy more than is written. He says the optimal trade-off is 3 degrees C, and he says he's for a carbon tax. But if you look into it, his carbon tax is so little and so far in the future that everything he's been saying for 20 years, everything he says is 28 different flavors of do nothing for the time being. And he has all sorts of different stories and ways of arriving at that conclusion.
I guess the punchline of what I was getting at is I wonder if there are people who have gone from no, it's not happening to yes, it's happening, but so what? I'm wondering how those people justify so quickly going, so without,
Well, one thing that is very positive is that most of the left has come around on nuclear, and the Republicans were always been for nuclear. And so there was a pro-nuclear bill in Congress, and in the Senate, it was passed 98-2. Bernie was one of the 2 against it because he hasn't changed his opinion about anything since 1970. But it's only the really hardcore progressives who are against nuclear. But the big environmental organizations are slow to come around on nuclear because their deep pocket donors came of age in the 70s when anti-nuclear was the big cause. And so these environmental organizations are worried that they will lose their big donors if they become pro-nuclear. But I think nuclear is the best way out of this.
Bill, I have a question, and I'm asking you to read people's minds. I know that. My question is this, and I'll phrase it this way. We know, those of us who try to be enlightened and learn the science, that climate change and a number of other issues are facing us on an existential level. And we see it happen.
Wait. Okay, human extinction in the next several centuries is not predicted. Nobody who knows what they're talking about is predicting. anything that severe.
Well, I can get into an argument with that,
You
but
said existential.
whether I'm right or wrong on that, let's say, well, if I'm wrong on it, then my question won't make much sense. But I think I've read enough that there are arguments that we do face an existential threat from climate change. It may not be the direct threat, but if it causes widespread disruption in our civilization,
And end of life, we know
it
that.
could end life, even that is not so good. Well, but then my question won't make sense. But assuming my question is right for the moment, there are people who are very wealthy and powerful, who have experts who tell them these things and tell them what's going on. And yet they are opposing movement to try to protect the planet. And my question is, what is in their mindset that they think that there, is it that they think, or you just said, oh, we're not gonna, it's not an existential threat, it's only a threat to poor people.
I
So
think
we
it's
can-
partly polarization. Anything the left is for, the right is against. And so
But these are people who know better. Ted Cruz knows darn well that he's not telling the truth. The fossil fuel industry executives and CEOs know darn well what's going on.
I'm not sure they do.
You don't think so? You're really just.
No, I think if you're an Exxon executive, you're working or thinking about work 80 hours a week, and your friends pass around climate skeptic stuff. Okay, I'm out of time.
Anyway.